Hello and welcome to this, the first of 4 video lectures about the human value of progress. It is called Geographical Luck and explores the question, how and where did agricultural civilizations develop? Around 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, wise man in Latin, or modern humans as we're sometimes called, started moving out of Africa in waves, eventually reaching nearly all corners of the globe. They were using language, making tools and shelter, controlling fire for cooking, living as social animals. Then something like 35,000 years ago, there's cave art in Indonesia. The humans are reflecting on what is and creating something new. They're using their imagination. They are conscious. 25,000 years ago, the last Neanderthal, close cousins of Homo sapiens, disappears. Humans now are the officially appointed super predators of planet Earth. This consciousness, was it everyone at once, one at a time, and exactly when? No one knows. But when you have cave art, you have consciousness. Other animals can use language, whales and dolphins, or tools and shelter. Birds drop rocks on nuts, chimps use sticks to get ants out of hollow branches, leopards live in caves. Tools, shelter, nothing unique. And there's some evidence that Homo erectus, a predecessor of Homo sapiens, was controlling fire 400,000 years ago. But only conscious beings produce art, reflecting on something and then using their imagination to create something new. How was life in hunter-gatherer bands? Well, there was no industry, no domesticated animals, no farmed crops. Hunter-gatherers lived in small groups, small bands, with weapons, tools, methods and tactics, and they could trade. Note that it was the social group working together that became the super predator, with tactics such as digging a hole and herding prey, like mammoths, into it with stones and spears and noisemakers. When one band bumps into another band, maybe you can trade instead of just that animal instinct of fight or flight, because trade can be done by conscious beings. Hobbes, a famous reflector on life in hunter-gatherer bands, famously said, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He used that to argue that life in agricultural civilizations was preferable to life in a hunter-gatherer band. And there are other indicators that that might be true. Some anthropologists have guesstimated the chance of a violent death in a hunter-gatherer band at 1 in 5. The violent death odds are only informed guesswork, but for comparison, the 20th century, for the world as a whole, it was around 1 in 50. That's with 2 world wars, colonialism, post-colonialism, and Marxist-inspired famines and massacres in Russia, China, and elsewhere. Hunter-gatherers had an animal existence. They subsisted. They ate only what they found and what they caught. They lived in caves. They were completely at the mercy of nature. As well as violent death, starvation or injury were constant threats. The poverty was extreme. There was only small glimpses of progress, fire and tools. They lived scattered. They were segregated territorially. People need to get along and cooperate in these bands to survive, but the concept of tolerance is not really relevant. And the world population of humans 10,000 years ago is estimated at around 2 to 4 million. Compared that to the 7 going on to 8 billion of today. As the slide header says, humans became conscious in primitive hunter-gatherer bands. Social animals that became individually conscious. That is essentially what we are. The fact that solitary confinement is an extreme form of punishment shows just how important the opportunity for social interaction with other people is to us. You, as an individually conscious being, need social interaction with other conscious beings. It's as simple as that. We are both individually conscious and socially formed. That is something fundamental about we humans, akin to the biological fact that we are bipedal, that we walk on two legs. Thus, in studying humans and our human nature, we must consider both the individual, that's consciousness, and society, the fact that we are a social animal. 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ends. The climate is now favorable to Homo sapiens, to humans, to us. We call it the Holocene. And then there's the first major conscious human adaptation, which is agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals, or farming. Now people are harnessing nature, using nature as a means for their own conscious ends, to eat. Agricultural civilizations could only arise with two preconditions. Firstly, the climate needed to be favorable, which means the ice has retreated, so there are temperate regions on Earth. And secondly, the farming of crops and domesticated animals is understood. Now humans are not completely at the mercy of nature. They have some agency over their lives. They have made progress. 7,000 years ago, the first civilization in Sumer, which is in modern-day Iraq, a place called Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a place geographically favorable for irrigation. The technology of irrigation means further progress. Now people are not completely at the mercy of rainfall. Those people who are geographically lucky enough to live in the right places can exploit that favorable geography and harness their environmentally provided assets with increased agricultural efficiency. They move beyond subsistence. They have a surplus to spend. They could conquer an empire, build pyramids, study the stars. Irrigation in the right places is rewarded with surplus. A surplus means you can feed more than just the people who work in the fields. As well as those laboring to tend the crops and animals, you can feed soldiers, builders, astronomers, sailors, scribes, and so on. And you have scholars and learning, so you can make more progress. Scholars and learning means that development speeds up a little. The result is technological innovation, something that hardly ever happened with hunter-gatherers. And if there was some innovation in hunter-gatherer bands, it was easily lost as a band moved, starved, or forgot. The Sumer agricultural civilization 7,000 years ago was only the first. Other agricultural civilizations arise. Here are three. Shang in China, 1766 before the Common Era, something around 4,000 years ago. In Mali, West Africa, there's a civilization that arose and was at its height in around 1235 of the Common Era, 800 years ago. The Aztecs in Mexico, 700 years ago, and many others. These three were not the first in their regions, just three examples from the hundreds of agricultural civilizations that have arisen around the world in the last 7,000 years. They all had similar technologies. They used irrigation, energy capture, food, storage, distribution, cities, ships, some industry and mining, and often writing as a store of information and knowledge. Energy capture comes from wind and water, with animals as engines to pull plows. And that raises the question, what to do with that surplus? Buildings are designed and built on land, ships launched on water, but the iPhone is going to have to wait because the pharaohs want giant tombs, the Egyptian pyramids. With writing, you can store and transfer knowledge as well. There's extreme social segregation. There are slaves, serfs tied to the land, and caste system where most people are on the lower rungs. And there are more distinct gender roles. So humans have also invented social issues, although they probably didn't think of it in that way then. There is great inequality, and the gender roles in agricultural civilizations are probably more distinct than in hunter-gatherer societies. It's important to note that all these agricultural civilizations, the many hundreds of them, arise independently. All are organized in exactly the same way, and all are big. The Aztecs, for instance, at their height, were something like 200,000 people strong. Agricultural civilization is a human universal. It's not something learned or copied from others. So the idea must be inside us already. If they arise independently of each other in different places and at different times throughout history. And they are many orders of magnitude larger than the 20 or so strong bands of hunter-gatherers. Agricultural civilizations were big because of technologies like irrigation, and these technologies are not for small bands. To maximize the agricultural efficiency that irrigation brings, you need large-scale cooperation. How did they leap from bands of 20 to city-states of 200,000? What was the secret? What secret ingredient did they have that was the same wherever agricultural civilizations arose? Because they were all arrived at independently each time. The secret ingredient that meant they could get past the limit on social group size of around 150. How did they do it? How did they beat Dunbar's number, the natural limit on the size of social groups? In the 1990s, an anthropologist, Robin Dunbar, suggested that there was a natural limit on how many people a person could maintain relationships with. This is Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number is the number for which stable relationships in a group are possible. You go beyond that number and the group becomes unstable. Dunbar's number is explained informally in Wikipedia. The number of people you would not feel embarrassed about joining uninvited for a drink if you happen to bump into them in a cafe or a bar. It has been proposed to lie between 100 and 250 with a commonly used value of 150. Dunbar's number states the number of people one knows and keeps social contact with. A stable group is only possible when everyone is an acquaintance, that is, everyone knows everyone else, even if only slightly. Any group that goes beyond Dunbar's number becomes unstable because then some people, some of the time, are having to deal with strangers. Through the ages, the military have strived to keep the size of tactical units below Dunbar's number to maintain cohesion, hence fighting spirit. You fight better if you're fighting with people you know than if you're fighting with strangers. Modern offices are planned with Dunbar's number in mind. Agricultural civilizations then needed something else, something other than the natural relations of groups under about 150 people. How were agricultural civilizations stable? Large and stable because of social order. Civilization means collaboration in groups much too large to be held together by the natural social cohesion of acquaintance and connection that keeps a small band together. For non-kin humans to collaborate on a huge scale requires something else. That something else we call social order. The template for this social order was always the same, but each agricultural civilization had their own interpretation, and we call that interpretation their culture. Social order means a formal hierarchy where society is consciously organized to function in a way that is prescribed. The structure is the same in all agricultural civilizations. Everywhere, the template is the same. Yes, there are variations which are interesting, and we call them cultural differences, but the template was always the same. There are three parts to this template: authority, something sacred, and loyalty. These are 3 of 6 moral principles explained by Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind. The 3 moral principles that form the template for social order in all agricultural civilizations are, firstly, authority. There's an absolute ruler plus an hereditary aristocracy, so you inherit titles. It's gene determined. They form a warrior class providing ruthless control. That control is provided by a ruler whose power is absolute. Think of a Roman emperor in the Colosseum giving the thumbs down or up to signal if a gladiator is to be killed. These rulers were often said to be from a divinely appointed dynasty, or at least have the favor of the gods. The next layer in the hierarchy is a tiny aristocratic and priestly elite. Then there are some overseers, specialists, non-commissioned officers and the like. That's around about 1% of the population, and they did lead meaningful lives. But the vast majority exist on the lower rungs of a caste system, or as serfs tied to the land, or for many as slaves in chains. The second part of the template is something sacred. Religious myth, objects, and ritual that give coherence, that bring people together. A priesthood with something meaningful, a transcendence for people to adhere to. Shared religious practices tied to the eternal cycle of growing seasons provide some rationale as to why we are here and why we should stick together. The third part is loyalty, allegiance to the king, czar, emperor, whatever the absolute ruler is called, and to their local lord, a lord who would have inherited the title or been appointed by the king. These people embody a formal tribal identity. The informal, natural loyalty to the clan in hunter-gatherer bands is replaced by a formal loyalty, often requiring pledges of allegiance to the tribal leaders who embody the tribal identity. This is social order version 1, coerced cooperation. Why coerced? Because few people wanted to leave the comfort zone of their small hunter-gatherer band. That's the dirty little not-so-secret recipe for large-scale cooperation in agricultural civilizations. Large-scale cooperation came about through force, through coercion. And those agricultural civilizations all expand and grow in the same way, through conquest, colonialism, and slavery. Agricultural civilizations came about through violence. They all expanded in the same way, through conquest. They created a surplus which they could spend on an army. Through colonialism, with the 3 T's, which are theft, tribute, which is a kind of protection money, plus they invented tax. And through slavery, when they dragged people back to the center of their empires in chains. There were 3 horsemen of the apocalypse riding towards these agricultural civilizations: war, famine, disease. These horsemen of the apocalypse disturbed these simple and static societies, for that is what agricultural civilizations were, simple and static. And these three horsemen of the apocalypse were war, famine, and disease. War within the society itself, usually due to a succession crisis. The king is dead, who's going to be the next king? Or war with external enemies. And famine due to the mass reliance on often single crops. And disease made more potent by living in close proximity to animals and in such large numbers. All agricultural civilizations which arose independently around the world came up with the same formula or template. Social order equals authority plus something sacred plus loyalty. All agricultural civilizations had a small elite, and for them at least, there was progress, increased knowledge, wealth, and health, but not so much for the 99%. How might we best describe this human age, starting 7,000 years ago in the Middle East and still going on in many parts of the world today, this long period of agricultural civilizations? It was the age when the strong ruled the weak, the only tolerance being the occasional act of mercy by the mighty. The age when if your army is bigger than mine, or you are more ruthless than me, then you are surely right. The age of agricultural civilizations of social order, version 1, coerced cooperation, we can call the age of might is right. So that's one question about agricultural civilizations dealt with. How did they get to be so big? To achieve large-scale cooperation? They did it with social order. Next question. Why did agricultural civilizations develop in some places and not others? This is an enduring question that has had consequences down to the present day. The question was expressed succinctly by a politician from Papua New Guinea called Yali. Yali's question: why is it that you white people developed so much cargo? In 1972, Jared Diamond was a biologist working in what was then New Guinea, now Papua New Guinea. The country had been colonized 200 years before by white settlers, mainly from Great Britain, and was now administered by Australia under a mandate from the UN. It was preparing for self-government. The indigenous population used the term cargo to mean material goods, as Diamond put it, ranging from steel axes, matches and medicines to clothing, soft drinks and umbrellas. Diamond was asked by a local politician, Yali, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? Diamond's subsequent book, Guns, Germs and Steel, was the answer to Yali's question. In 2 words, Diamond's answer was lucky latitudes. The Lucky Latitudes is a band that goes around the world. A band of temperate climate around the earth that favoured agriculture with the best types of crops for farming and livestock for domestication. It covers China, the Middle East and Southern Europe, as well as parts of the Americas. In this band, after the last ice age, the climate is temperate. That means not too hot, not too cold. These lucky latitudes also had the best animals for domestication, like chickens, pigs, goats and cows, and the best crops for farming, like wheat, rice, corn. These were the lucky latitudes where agricultural civilizations arose first. So where were the geographically lucky places? So the luckiest place of all was the Fertile Crescent in present-day Lebanon. There are low-lying hills with good rainfall. It must be the luckiest place because that's the first place where farming was done. And it's easy to move from the Fertile Crescent to the floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates River, when irrigation was developed by the Summer civilization of Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, 7,000 years ago. The second luckiest place is China. A couple of thousand years after the Summer civilization, there's irrigation on the floodplain between the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. You can see how the two luckiest regions were at the western and eastern ends of the Eurasian lucky latitudes. That's where we get the idea of a west and an east. Everywhere else was geographically unlucky. The geographically unlucky included Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa was doubly unlucky. It's not in the lucky latitudes, it's too far south, and the Sahara Desert restricts north-south diffusion of technological and cultural innovations from the Middle East and later from Europe. So if something clever, innovative is developed in the lucky latitudes, it's hard for that innovation to travel down across the Sahara Desert. The Indian subcontinent, also doubly unlucky. It's not in the lucky latitudes, and the Himalayas restrict diffusion from China. Innovations don't get from China into India because of the Himalayas. They act as a barrier. The Americas. America's partly in the lucky latitudes, but it's a long way to get there from Africa, where modern humans started out from. So the Americas were settled late. Australasia, a very long way from the lucky latitudes and really hard to get to from Africa. So again, it was settled late. An important note, there was no destiny of the white race or Chinese superiority involved. It was purely because of geographical luck that human progress favored two distinct regions, the western lucky latitudes, which is the Middle East and later Europe, and the eastern lucky latitudes, China. Essentially, the answer to Yarley's question is, firstly, geographical luck. Why it was Europeans, white people, who ended up in Papua New Guinea, where Yarley asked his question, and not the Chinese, is discussed in the third video lecture on the human value of progress called Cultural Good Fortune. But to repeat, in plain language, because it is an important but simple fact, this was geographical determinism, nothing to do with genes, race, or ethnicity. Thank you for watching. The next in the series, Understanding Ourselves Through Our Human Values, is the second of 4 video lectures about the human value of progress. It is called Capitalism Gets Going and answers the not so trivial question, what was the most important event in world history? It can be found at www.conservators.com, where there's reasoning that resonates. Conservators, keep safe, intact, save from danger our human values.